All right, here we are, almost finished. I do believe this is going to be the last pool video.
Yes.
In this video, we are going to be constructing a custom shader for our pool. It's going to be just a little bit more interesting than the Talented Balls custom shader. In this particular case, we have a texture that we're going to use. The texture is of a diamond. We're going to use the diamond to paint the exterior of the pool wall. But then we need for the rest of the pool not to have this texture. So it just needs to simply be colored. So we're going to have some extra considerations to take into account when determining how we're going to place this texture on the surface itself. So Steve, before we jump into this, since we're not going to whiteboard this, go ahead and give us a quick overview.
Well, we're going to create a custom shader, and it's going to be a VopVex surface shop, as we saw with our character. And it's going to basically be a similar shader to the character. The only difference being, instead of driving the color by just a texture, we're either going to drive the color by a texture or by a constant color, and we're going to switch between those two based on a parameter that we're going to add to our geometry, such that the parameter sets us to the texture for that outside wall, and the parameter switches us over to the color for the rest of the object. So that's a brief overview.
That sounds very good. All right, let's go and put it together.
Cool. So I'm going to jump down inside our pool asset. I'm going to create a shop network. So tab shop, enter, enter. I'm going to rename this to pool shop. And then I'm going to jump down inside by pushing enter. I'm going to create a material to house our shader. So material, enter, enter, which I'm going to name m_pool. I'm going to push enter to jump down inside. I'm going to create a VopVex surface shop. So enter. And enter and wire this out of our material. Jumping down inside of our material, for now I'm going to drop in a lighting model. And that's going to give us access to our ambient colors, diffuse colors, specular colors, and
so we don't have to do all of the components ourselves and then add them together.
Because this is pre-built for us, and it serves perfect for what we need here. So I'm going to wire the color output into the output of our shader, and for now I'm going to bring in a parameter Vop, enter and enter to place that, which I'm going to call diffuse color. I am going to set the parameter type to be a color, the parameter name to diffuse color, and the label to diffuse color, and we can take that color and wire it in for now to our diffuse color input on the lighting model. I'm going to come over to this parameter on the color tab. I'm just going to set the default color to a sort of off, beige kind of color. Something like that, so almost white, just slightly beige.
Okay.
Maybe a little more towards the white. Something like that. So that's just going to act as our default. Now if we jump up, we can see that we've got this diffuse color on our Vop surface due to the fact it's a parameter. We can take this parameter, promote it up to our asset, and then we're going to have control over the diffuse color at asset level. So I'm going to jump up so that we can see our pool asset. I'm going to right click and bring up the type properties, that is off the bottom of the screen. And I'm going to just collapse that down, jump back inside our pool shop, back inside our material, and right click on our diffuse color parameter on the VopVex surface shop and export that to our type properties. I'm going to just drop in a new folder so we can create a shader folder. So let's rename this to shader. Enter. And single click drag our diffuse color into that folder and accept.
Very good.
Fantastic. So with that, we do need to now assign the shader to our object. I'm going to do this after the merge, since we're going to deal with switching between if we want a texture or a color in the shader as opposed to assigning two different shaders to our geometry. We can assign all of our geometry the same shader, and I'm going to do that by wiring a material swap after our merge all. So I'm going to right click on the output of merge all, type material, enter, and enter. I will bring the visibility back down to our transform. And here for the material parameter of the material swap, I'm going to bring up the browser, jump into our pool shop, and grab m_pool, making sure to export the relative path. So that should, if we render out, give us a beige coloured pool. Fantastic. Now it'd be really cool if this pool looked beige in the viewport. That's really easy to achieve. So we can jump into our pool shop, back into our pool material, and we can simply link our OpenGL diffuse color to the diffuse color that's on our asset. So I'm going to, instead of copying this parameter and pasting it, linking this parameter into this parameter, I'm going to copy the expression so that both OpenGL diffuse and diffuse color are referencing our asset.
That's right.
So I'm going to right-click, copy parameter, and in OpenGL diffuse, I'm going to right-click and paste copied expressions. So now our OpenGL diffuse is also referencing the diffuse color up on our asset. So now we have our diffuse color affecting the viewport as well.
Very nice.
So let's jump back into our shader. And I'm going to create a texture VOP, enter and enter. And I'm going to set up our UV system. We've seen this before, so I'm going to create a parameter VOP, rename this to UV import. Make sure that we're bringing in 3 floats as a vector, the parameter name being lowercase u and v. The parameter label, I'm going to call UV coords. I'm going to check invisible. I'm going to right-click on the output, the UV output, and wire this into a vector to float. Enter and enter. And I'm going to wire fval1 into S and fval2 into T. So our texture is now set up to use UVs. I'm going to promote the texture map up onto our asset. And once it's up on the asset, I'm then going to select our diamond texture. So to do that, I'm going to jump up until we can see our asset. Right-click and bring up its type properties. I got the right-clicked on the asset up in the path gadget. I'm then going to jump back inside so we can see that parameter. So down on our texture VOP, I'm going to right-click on texture map, export parameter to type properties. Drag that into the shader, and I just rename this to diffuse map. Accept. And then I will jump up to where we can see our asset, right-click, grab the parameters, and let's just browse now over on the shader tab. Let's grab in our textures folder the pool diamond.jpg. So I'm going to accept that, and we can close that out. So that's going to give us a texture or a diffuse color, and we need a way to switch between these on the fly. And switch is the great word, the most appropriate word, I guess, because we're going to use a switch VOP. So type switch, enter, enter. And the switch VOP takes in a switcher, which is an integer value that represents switching between indices, and it takes inputs. So our first input is going to be our diffuse color, and our second input is going to be our texture map. With a switcher index of 0, we're going to be feeding out our diffuse color. If we switch this to 1, we're now going to feed out our texture map color. I'm going to rename the texture VOP to diffuse texture. Now, instead of driving this manually by switching between 0 and 1, if we create a parameter that's bound to certain pieces of geometry and bring that parameter in, much like we bring in our UVs, we can drive this switch index differently for different pieces of geometry and thus switch between our texture and our diffuse color. Now, what I do want to do, our texture is a white square with a red diamond. If we were to have white background with a red diamond around here going into beige, that's going to look weird, but we can take that beige color, multiply it by white, and that will give us the beige color, and it will tint the red slightly. But if we were to multiply our diffuse texture by this color before feeding it into here, we'll make sure that we don't get any seams in colors. So to do that, I'm going to right click on the output of our diffuse texture, and I'm going to wire in a multiply VOP, enter and enter, and simply take our diffuse color into the second input of the multiply. So let's just space things out slightly. So we've got our diffuse texture coming in, being multiplied by the diffuse color, and we've also got just the diffuse color on its own. We're switching between the two, and we want the result to be the diffuse color for our lighting model. So let's jump up and create that parameter at SOP level. It's going to allow us to switch between the two. That's going to be really nice and easy. So what I'm going to do, the outer tube is the only piece of geometry that needs that texture. So if we group him where we can easily group just this piece of geometry, and then later when we have all our geometry, we can reference that group when creating the parameter to say, if the geometry is in this group, give me a value of 1. If the geometry is not in this group, give me a value of 0, knowing that on the switch, if we use a value of 0, we just get the color. If we get a value of 1, we're going to get that texture. So I'm going to right click on the output of our outer tube and wire this into a group SOP. Push enter and enter. And I'm just going to call this group outer pool. The group type, well, the group name is going to be outer pool group. I am going to be grouping primitives in this case. That's just a personal choice. I'm going to group primitives. I'm going to create a primitive attribute, just because it makes sense for me to be dealing with primitives having a texture assigned or not assigned, as opposed to points having a texture assigned and not assigned. So that's going to group all of that tube. So now we can come down after our merge all, and we can create attributes for our primitives such that we can basically control that switch between 0 and 1. So what I'm going to right click on the output of merge all and wire this into an attrib create. There we go, so an attrib create SOP, enter and enter. We're going to create an attribute that we're going to call pool text toggle. Now I'm not going to specify the group here because we want to create this attribute on everybody. We're going to use the group to define the value of the attribute as opposed to only add an attribute to that group. The class is going to be primitive. We're going to be assigning a 1 or 0 value to the primitives as opposed to points. And since it's 1 or 0, I'm going to create an integer attribute. So in value, we can set the value for the attribute that's going to be assigned. We don't have to set it with a constant number. It doesn't have to always be 0 or 1. We can use an expression here and have the expression evaluated on a primitive by primitive basis, such that the primitives that belong to this outer tube will get a value of 1, everybody else will get a value of 0. So I'm going to bring up the expression editor for this value with Alt-E. And we're going to use the hasPrim expression, which hasPrim, if we type hasPrim and bring up the brackets, it takes in a group name. And so we're going to specify that group we created. And then it takes in a node that we want to basically check the group when we're on the node that we want to check the geometry for. And then we take in a primitive number. And what it's going to do for the node that we specify, it's going to look to see if the primitive number we specify belongs to the group that we specify. So what we can do, we can specify our pool outer group. It's possibly called, hang on, let me double check the spelling of the group because I think I've possibly called it outer pool group. Outer pool group. We do want to make sure that we get that group name correct. So that was outer pool group. We want to specify a surface node. We can't specify ourselves because then we get an infinite loop. But what we can do is we can just say, okay, well, whoever feeds into us. And to do that, we can use another expression, and that's the op input path expression. This is going to return a path to a node, which we need a path to a node in this case. But it means that if we were to rewire or rename this node, things won't break down because we're always just going to take whoever our input is. And we saw this in the fundamentals when we dealt with dynamics, looking at the automatic creation of dynamics networks referencing nodes that plugged in to a particular node. So op input path takes a node that we want to find the input to. In this case, this is going to be us, so we can specify that just with a dot. And the index, well, we only have one input, so we want index 0, our first input. So this is going to return whoever plugs into us, into our first input. So in this case, it's going to be merge all. So we're saying, okay, look at merge all, look for outer pool group. We need to look to see if a primitive is in that group, and we can, on a primitive by primitive basis, like we've used $pt to reference point number, we can use $pr to reference the primitive number. So we're going to come in and we're going to evaluate this, and each primitive is going to have a different primitive number. It's going to be the same primitive number as up on the merge all since it is the same geometry. And we're going to check each primitive to see, do we belong in this group? If we do belong in this group, it will evaluate to true, we'll get a 1 value. If we do not belong in this group, we'll get a 0 value. And this is going to be created as the attribute, if we accept this, as the attribute pool text toggle. We can see this if we right click on attribute create, we can bring up a spreadsheet, and we can set ourselves over to the primitives tab. And we can see we have 4 primitives. This is going to be our outer tube as a value of 1. One of these is going to be our bevel, one's going to be the inner tube, one's going to be the inner circle, but we can see everybody else has a value of 0. If we bring up our primitive numbers, primitive 0 is this outer tube, and he's got a value 1. It's a little bit difficult to see there. But what's important to see is we have 4 primitives, only one of them has that value, the others have 0, so we can tell that this is evaluating correctly. So let's close off the spreadsheet, and now let's deal with bringing this parameter in so we can actually use it in our shader. So I'm going to double click on Pool Shop, double click on the material and on the VOP network to jump inside. And much as we brought in UVs using a parameter VOP, I'm going to create a new parameter VOP to bring in a newly created parameter. The parameter we created was of an integer type. The name of the parameter was pool text toggle. Again, like with UVs, this casing and spelling is very important. We created a parameter with a specific name. We need to look for that specific name here. And this is the same name as we used when we created the parameter. I'll just call this pool text toggle with a label, and I'll call this pool text toggle import. So we're bringing in that pool text toggle.
Go ahead and make it invisible as well.
Yeah, sure. Since we are not controlling it up on our shader itself, but rather we're controlling it by binding it to the geometry. So I'm going to bring this over to our switch, and we can bring this pool text toggle parameter and use it as our switch input. What that's going to do is, instead of setting this manually, we're setting this to a value of 0 for everybody but the outside tube, and a value of 1 for that outside tube. A value of 0 means that everybody but the outside tube just gets the diffuse color, whereas when it switches to 1 for the outside tube, we get the diffuse color multiplied by that texture. So that diamond texture will get assigned to the outside. Whatever this is being fed through the switch gets pumped into our lighting model used as our diffuse color. The diffuse color of the lighting model then gets pumped to our output, including all of our specular and all of our lighting. Now if we were to render now, we're not going to see our texture, and that's because of the fact that we haven't yet created UVs for that outer tube, but we can render just to prove that we're not going to yet see our texture. So let's create UVs for that outer tube. This is going to be nice and simple since it's a cylindrical object. So I'm going to create the UVs straight after our tube. So let's wire this into a UV texture. And let's create cylindrical UVs with a projection axis of Y. And for now I'll leave the scale large. We're going to see that's going to stretch the diamond all the way around. We can change that in a second. So if we render now, there's a diamond stretched all the way around. This is going to be a simple fix. We're dealing in this case, due to the cylinder being centered up around basically its axis on Y, scaling in X is going to be scaling in this direction. So we can set our scale X and we can increase that, and that's going to give us more repetition. So something like 20 will probably work quite nicely. That's pretty cool. So just to prove, because obviously we didn't see the texture due to lack of UVs, you may be thinking, well, we can't see the texture on everybody else, maybe due to lack of UVs and not because of the switch. I'm going to copy this guy and paste him. I'm going to wire, actually I'll just use a new one, create a new UV texture after our inner tube. Set this to cylindrical, again scale X of 20. So now we'll have UVs on our inner tube. If our switch isn't working, we'll see the diamond. We shouldn't see the diamond due to the attribute and the switch that we've set up. Fantastic. So we have diamonds on the outside and not on the inside. We don't need UVs here since we're just creating color. Now what I am going to do is promote up some of the other parameters up to our asset, things like specular color and specular roughness and the likes. So I'm going to bring up the type properties for our asset by right-clicking on Pool in the Path gadget. Come down to Type Properties. Let's jump into our shot network, into our material and into our shader. And on the lighting model VOP, I'm going to promote up ambient color. So right-click, Export Parameter to Type Properties. I'm going to promote up specular color, right-click, export parameter to type properties. And let's also export our U roughness as well. So right-click, export parameter to type properties. I'll rename this guy to specular roughness. Select all three of these and put them in the shading folder. And if we accept that, we'll see these are now being controlled up on our asset. Our asset has diffuse color, the diffuse map, which is going to be used on the outside, ambient color, specular color, and specular roughness. So let's right click on our asset and save it out. And right click and match the current definition, since we've now completed the construction of the pool.
Very nice. And with that, anything else you want to add in?
No, that's absolutely everything.
Okay. Well, that is going to conclude the pool asset. Thanks a lot.